Good afternoon. We'll give everyone a minute or two to join us. You're just joining in. Welcome to our final Public Viewpoints webinar of 2020. We're going to give everyone just a minute to get logged in and join us, and look forward to kicking off shortly. Great. Well, it looks like we're going to have a full house today. Good afternoon. I'm Jenna Talbot, Senior Vice President at Whiteboard Advisors. And I've had the pleasure of being your host over the last 9 months with this series as we've looked at recent data, weekly data from Strada Education Network. We've been polling since March over 25,000 Americans to date, asking them about the impact of the pandemic on their lives, their education, the connection to work. And so we're going to spend some time today really reflecting on what we've learned so far and what the implications are for 2021. As we all know, this pandemic is not over. So we will certainly continue to talk to consumers, understand their needs, and that'll be part of our conversation today. Before we get started, though, I do want to open us up with some reflections from learners. I think one of the most powerful things we've done in this series is hear directly from Americans who have been impacted in different ways, and hear how their education experience has been in the midst of this pandemic. So we will start with a short video, and then we'll get into some Q&A today. We've got our research team from the Center for Education Consumer Insights, who I'll introduce momentarily. But Kylie, if you want to go ahead and start our video.
This pandemic, going to school, losing a job has been very challenging.
The intent has almost, in the student body, the intent has almost moved from collecting knowledge to instead, how do we move through and get through these assignments? Because there's so many other stressors, there's so many other things that are influencing your daily lives.
But I feel as though I've received the least support from people that are actually tasked with supporting both my financial, academic, and professional endeavors. My academic advisor, I haven't talked to her at all this year.
Because of COVID-19, a lot of those internships have just kind of like disappeared. So we've been scrambling to find different avenues for online internships and stuff like that.
The support from my instructor in terms of making sure not just that we have her email and her phone number and those types of things, but actually checking in, hi, how are you doing? Or, hey, I noticed you might have been a little late with this. Is there something I can do to help you?
Honestly, online learning is the only way I would have been able to finish my degree.
I've obtained those skills or that knowledge just on my own. And I wish that there was more of that embedded into the curriculum.
We need people out there on the forefront to say, hey, look, I've done it. You can do it. You don't have anything to be scared of.
I guess I would say that y'all have the power right now, today, to go and change some kid's life. Like, if you really are about that, helping kids and changing all that systemic stuff, then you got to go down and actually meet these kids. Like, if you have a degree, if you've been through college, you can do that. Go and just talk to them. Your experience is what kind of changed my life.
So today we're going to reflect, and the words of Chigo have stuck with the team. You can do it. You can change lives. Today we're going to reflect on what have we learned so far from this effort. What have we heard from Americans? What are they looking for from education We're going to spend some time reflecting and then talk through implications. And this is where we really hope today continues to be a collaborative conversation. I think as we reflect back on the webinar series since March, we've had so many great repeat attendees weighing in, sharing what's working in their communities, asking great questions of our panelists and of our research team. And so we hope that we continue that today, and certainly want to hear from you as we think about implications for 2021. What should we be looking at and paying attention to, as we know the work here is not done. So for today, I'm excited to be joined by the three brilliant and incredible researchers behind this body of work. We have Dave Clayton, Senior Vice President at the Center for Education Consumer Insights, as well as Nicole Torpi-Sabo, Director of Research, and Andrew Hansen, also Director of Research. So we'll kind of go through a few key findings here. Feel free to drop questions in as we go. If you've got questions about particular findings, we'll take them and we'll incorporate them into the conversation. And then, as always, we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. Please use the Q&A section for your questions. And of course, share your name and affiliation. We love to know who's with us. So thank you for participating. Dave, let's start with you. So early on in the public Viewpoint work, you were focused on wrapping your arms around the impact of the pandemic on work and education. Just what the heck is going on here in these early moments? What did you learn, and where do we stand today?
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. If I might say, there have been some surprises, and we'll highlight some of those in where we check the numbers 5 times. Is this really right? Things that surprised us and that have generally played out in different ways. But I think there are a couple other surprises before we get into the survey research, and one has been you as an audience. We envisioned this when we started out on an airplane Friday, March 13th, as things were shutting down and we're getting emails not to go into the office. And it's like, what can we do? How do we help? And let's track some things. Just like unemployment's going to get tracked, let's track the people's feelings about job security and need for education and things. And what we learned from you and with you through your questions in these webinars is it became a very dynamic opportunity to hear what you wanted to know, and then to go out and change our questions each week and to pursue those answers and come back to you with those insights. So that was a surprise from what we expected and what we envisioned when we started out. So we've been learning with you and are just tremendously appreciative. I think the other part that has been a surprise in an uplifting way, maybe not a surprise, but a needed strength to me personally, and I think to you, to one another, is the sense of community. Your reaffirmation of why you do this and why you care, that comes through in your chat comments and in your emails and your communications with us, and the affirmation of being focused on the individuals that we serve, that look to education and its promise to improve their lives and circumstances. And that feeling, Chigo said, change a life, you can do it. And just that feeling that we can do it together. And I'm very appreciative of that, Jenna, and forgive my little preamble, and I'll turn to your question. Getting on that plane on Friday, March 13th and saying, here we go. First of all, we thought, okay, we're not going into the office. People are not going to the office. Borders are closing. We need to track there'll be people focused on health. But for those who we seek to serve in education and education connecting to work outcomes generally, what can we track and understand? And so it was remarkable. In the first week from March 25th to April 1st, there were double-digit 10, 11, 15% percentage point jumps in people who were worried about they were going to lose their job, who felt like, or who reported that they had started losing income and shifts and hours and jobs already. Just in that 1 week, you saw the double digits. So we knew before the we had early indicators before those massive, 20 million jobs lost in April, that the American public was telling us this is hitting broad and deep across all walks of life. And so from that, we started to look at, well, will people turn to education? So this slide that you see up now, 35% of Americans agreeing that if they were to lose a job, they would need more education or training to find a job and to replace it. And so that promise of education is real for fully a third of the workforce to feel this way. We asked another question that we didn't report out on, but we tried to push people one way or another. Is education a waste of time and money and it won't really make a difference in an uncertain economic time? Or is it essential to having a good job, to learn new skills and get education training? 2/3 of Americans said it's essential. So this belief in the promise of education has been persistent throughout. And even this number you see, this 35% is an average. It started out at 32% in April, and by October it was 41%. So that this belief that they will need education is climbing and is persisting for Americans, which is not is the paradox. That's not what we're seeing in the enrollment numbers, right? So underneath all of that, we've started to try and understand what's happening and why is interest and intent and belief in the idea and promise of education not translating into personal action and plans and enrollment pursuit. So I think we'll all speak some to that, but that's really a key theme we'll be watching into 2021 is, does that belief start to translate into enrollment and pursuit of education and training? I think will be a key issue for our nation, not just for our industry and those of us who work in this space. One of the other places where we've done some work a year in late summer 2019, looking at aspiring adults and why they said they would be interested in aspiring adult learners. Nicole will correct me, get my language right. But why they said they were interested in pursuing education. And then we knew we were hearing right in May the health concerns about being in education and locked down and being out and access to technology and reliable. So we pulled together this question and expecting different results than we got. It was remarkable that in the midst of discussion about free college, in the middle of a pandemic, in the concerns and the pressure on technology, the traditional cost barriers of time and logistics, that self-doubt was on par with cost. And amongst the disrupted workers, people who'd lost education or lost work and who were most interested, that self-doubt was 56% compared to cost being 51%. So the more interested and in need people were, the higher their doubt about. Now, what does self-doubt mean? There were two questions behind that. One is, not certain I can be successful as a student in a learning and training environment. And the other is, I've been away from school too long. And so it's going back to this world that they were not familiar with. And so we'll talk about this a little as we go along, but I think there are three pieces that will be essential to convert belief in the promise of education into personal plans and action of pursuing it. And so at the front end is this self-doubt, right? Can people like me, we saw Slim in the video at the opening saying we need to see people saying you can do it, and people who look like me and work where I work and live where I live, for all of us. And so the front end, the confidence in yourself and helping people. And then there's significant questions about, will the education turn into a job? I need a work outcome. That's my goal right now in this crisis. And with the unpredictability in the economy, we've seen that move a lot, right? On June 10th, people thought things were a lot better. And by September and October, people were more worried again. So it ebbs and flows. And so that confidence in the economy, we'll be watching closely as the economy becomes more predictable, will people's belief in the value of education increase and rebound with that? Because we'll look at that number in a minute, but that's maybe one of the more most discouraging numbers we've seen is the collapse in people's confidence in the value of education over the past year. So,
Dave, if I could jump in here, on this question of Jenna's question of where we stand today, I think the labor market context is super relevant. Early on, as you mentioned, we were tracking a lot of the labor market side of things with our survey before the census was able to come out with their numbers and the BLS a month or two later. But now we have a better understanding of those dynamics. And so, you mentioned people's fears sort of coming down in June. That was for good reason. A lot of the jobs came back right away in the summer. This was really looking like a V-shaped recovery. We got half of the 24 million jobs that we lost back within those first 2 months. But the past few jobs reports that we've had have not been good. They've not been very good at all. So, that right half of what was supposed to be that V, that keeps bending. And so what you're seeing is that job growth is getting slower and slower. So we're still 10 million jobs in the hole. And we've only added 250,000 jobs last month. And so you can see, at that pace, it'll take years for us to get back to a full jobs recovery. At the same time, we're seeing this population of long-term unemployed workers continue to grow, as well as folks who are dropping out of the workforce. So together, that's about 10 million Americans that we're talking about. And so the focus of our work, to your point, I think is, how do we get these folks back on their feet? How do we get them back to work? And one thing that I think we have to understand going forward is that the jobs and the skills that are in demand are changing. So the effect of recessions are that they tend to accelerate, these long-term changes in the occupational structure of the labor market, the skills that are in demand. To give you an example, if we go back to the Great Recession, we lost 5.5 million high school jobs. Only 500,000 of those came back. And so, this construction was the hardest hit in that recession. This time it's leisure and hospitality. But we have seen that there are fields where the jobs are growing, fields like healthcare, transportation and warehousing. Amazon's, I read the other day that they've hired 430,000 workers in 10 months, which is incredible. I mean, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. We've seen manufacturing's up, software and IT, sales and marketing. And so to your point, there's a lot of work to be done, but we need to help people, Americans and educators build an awareness of where that demand is, because as I said, it's ever changing. We need to cultivate their interests in fields where those opportunities to exist, and then we need to build programs that are aligned with what's in demand in the job market. And so it's a tall order, and as we go forward, we have to stay on top of what's going on in the economy and where it is, and as we're listening to Americans.
I just wanted to add a little bit more to what Andrew was saying in terms of how we've been seeing the job loss, and then, how the recovery is looking, and just to emphasize the disparities that we've been seeing. And I think that's something that, so on that first slide, that we were looking at with how many people believe that they would need more education, there was a comment in the chat, from Catherine Mershon there, I see, that said, okay, 35% of people also disagree that they would need more education. And one of the things that we see that's kind of counterintuitive is you would maybe expect people who didn't have college degrees to be more likely to say they need more education, but it is actually the opposite. So a lot of times what we see is people who already have some college education are the most eager to say, yeah, I need more, I'll go back, this is worth it. Whereas people who don't have that experience, maybe had a bad experience in the past with education, are the most doubtful about whether it's going to pay off for them. And so again, I think we're going to get a little bit more into talking about disparities, but that's certainly another thing that the pandemic has accelerated. has been disparities along educational attainment levels, as we've seen, the split in recovery and who's been most impacted. And that's the same with, who's had to change their education plans. And also with a lot of these indicators we're seeing on confidence, who believes that they can do it are people who've had success in the past. And so if we think about it in those terms of the people who are most trying to serve, how can we change that narrative and help people believe that education is for them and it's something that can change their lives? And
I would just add, I think people have still very strong and deep belief that education, the promise of education is real. It's a path forward. And so the battle is not an emotional, I believe education's good. It's a specific one of, I believe this education will help me get this job and I can do it while I'm working, managing kids, finance it, whatever it is. And so it gets into the rational kind of problem solving and planning, not the promising, but the personal plans is how I see that behavior change of converting interest into action. And to the extent we can do that, with our outreach and engagement of communities and individuals, will be powerful. I bet Jenna has more than one question. But
we do have a few more to get through, but actually one of the questions that popped up in the chat, and Nicole, you just alluded to this, is what has been the breakdown by race and ethnicity? We of course know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on individuals of color, and that has been something we've been tracking very closely. So Nicole, can you walk through, I know we're just going to touch on the surface, there's so much more, and we can direct folks to some of the specific breakdowns that we've done, but can you speak to what we've learned so far?
Yeah, for sure. And Dave, I think if you move on, we actually have another visual that would be good on this one. Yeah, this one. So, as we've all been learning, the pandemic had disproportionate health impacts on communities of color. And then likewise, with the indicators we were tracking, communities of color, our Latino Americans and Black Americans were more likely to have lost their job and more likely to have had to cancel their education plans. So, all of these, in all these ways, they were really the hardest hit. At the same time,
Nicole, let's go back and emphasize that one, because we saw a massive disruption, like 65% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they canceled or changed their education plans in May. But for the Black and Latinx Americans, those changes and cancellations were much likely to be complete rather than reducing credit hours, changing a provider, changing what I'm studying. It was like, I'm delaying my enrollment, I'm stopping out. And so even the nature of change was more severe, or the connection to education was more fragile for those communities.
Absolutely. And I think we saw that in the enrollment numbers when the community colleges were particularly hardest hit, who serve a lot of those communities. It's, if it's already a, struggle to balance all these things, and then COVID hits, that it was just maybe too much to try to be doing it all at the same time. However, I think a hopeful thing that we've seen, and this is a pattern that was evident in our data even before COVID. We've been doing this research with Americans for since 2016, and consistently what we see again and again are that Latinos and Black Americans express a much higher interest in education than our white survey respondents. And so I think there's tremendous amount of just interest and enthusiasm about the promise of education in these communities. We had some great chats with Deborah Santiago and Brian Bridges at UNCF as well about this topic. But that these communities are really, they really want to be able to get education. They believe in it, and that that isn't necessarily the the struggle for those communities. Maybe for some other groups, you have to do more convincing about why education is worth it. But that here we just see tremendous interest. So then, what can we do to really take away the barriers and make sure that it's delivering on that promise as well? Andrew or Dave, did you guys have anything else you wanted to add about this one?
I heard last week I was presenting in a panel, and Learner-Centric said it's an opportunity gap. Right? There's interest and there's need, and for these communities there's this gap, and how do we address it? And we see broadly lots of needs that we can apply that would benefit all, but particularly address these gaps in ability to act on interest, right?
So Nicole, we've started to touch on this as well, but talk to us about, we've asked Americans a lot, some of the questions that are popping up in the chat around this kind of the question of self-confidence, but then also value of education and what do they actually want and what are they expecting. So you've spent a lot of time thinking about what are Americans expecting from education and training. And we've looked at this question pre-pandemic, so you can also speak to how that's maybe shifted in the last year.
Yeah, so this slide you see here is from a survey that we did of currently enrolled students. And what you're seeing here are two different metrics. One is we're asking people, will your education be worth the cost? And so that's on the vertical. And then horizontal, we ask them, how well does your college or university do at helping connect students to a meaningful career, connect their education to a meaningful career? And so what we see again and again in this slide and in every single way we ask this question on every survey is just a really strong connection between these 2 points. So students believe that their education is putting them on a career path, they're much, much more likely to say that it's going to be worth the cost and see the value. So, I mean, we've asked this in a number of different ways, as you've alluded to, when we ask people, why are they pursuing education? Career motivations are right up there at the top. If we ask people if education was worth it when they're looking back, it really depends on, whether they felt like it was giving them skills for a career. And I think this is, it's more nuanced than just the straight up ROI measures that we're often looking at. I think those are good, and I think those are really important. We see College Scorecard is releasing more about earnings at the program level, and I think that's all really good for transparency and people having that information. What we've just found though is that connecting to a career isn't always exactly the same thing as, is my education going to allow me to make as much money as possible? But really, what's my dream? And did education help me to fulfill that purpose for which I set out for? So if your dream is to become a teacher, you're not earning the most money, but in our survey results, we've seen some of the most satisfied alumni saying, yes, my education prepared me for that career path. So I just think it's, this is not a shift from the pandemic. It's, it may be even more accelerated as some of the other things we've seen, but this is very consistent.
The shift, go ahead, Andrew.
And I think just to reinforce what Dave mentioned earlier, there's this gap, between people's belief in education, the value of education in the abstract as something, a societal good, and then looking around and saying, I can't find an education or a training program that suits my needs, that's going to actually help me take that next step in my career. And I think that's, what I mentioned earlier, building awareness of the opportunities that are available. A lot of times people don't understand that. Just to give you an example, I mean, there's 460,000 job openings in manufacturing. It's up 3% compared to last year. When we asked people who are interested in changing fields where they wanted to go, only 2% of them said that they wanted to go into manufacturing. They've got an understanding of manufacturing as, dirty jobs, which is not, if you go into the industry and you look at what people actually do, the jobs are completely different. All the old tasks that, were kind of gave it a dirty job side, those have all been automated. And so people need more opportunities, I think, to understand, what's available, because sometimes you get surprised. I didn't know that I would take the career trajectory that I did. I think many of us, we kind of go about our careers in very surprising ways. And so we need to find ways to connect people to new information and opportunities.
I was just going to say, Maybe, well, Jenna, you kind of asked Nicole about some shift. Was there something you were thinking about that was, I know what I'm thinking about, but did you have a thought, Jenna, in there?
No, go ahead. I've got a few follow-up questions that are popping up in the chat that I think are relevant, but go ahead, Dave.
Well, so here, this group is the group you'd expect to be the most optimistic about the value of education, currently enrolled students, bachelor's degree, undergraduates. But they were low on average overall. And when we looked at the disrupted workers, who are the ones who say they're more interested because of COVID in education, that's where the increased demand or interest lies. And we looked at the aspiring adult learners, or adults without degrees who are planning to enroll or seriously considering it. That group, their confidence fell by half from fall 2019 to fall 2020. And that alarms me, that those individuals who are interested but don't have credentials and they're less confident about the value of education being worth the cost and will it help them get a good job, half as likely.
Yeah. Why don't you switch, Dave? That's actually the next, I think you're talking about this one, right? So yeah, I was going to say, as Dave has been alluding to this is the shift that we've seen is, even though it's consistent that people want that connection, their confidence in that connection has dropped a lot this year. So these are people who strongly agree that whether education will be worth the cost or whether it will help them get a good job. And, as you mentioned, Dave, it's just a really, really big shift compared to this time last year with the same population of adults thinking about enrolling in education. So this is pretty concerning to us, and I think, may have to do with just general uncertainty right now about the labor market and, what jobs are going to be available. But I think speaks to maybe some of that disconnect between people being interested in education, but yet the enrollment numbers dropping. And how that climate of uncertainty may be impacting it right now.
Well, I think another part of the story here for this aspiring adult population, which remember we're talking about 25 to 44-year-olds, and that's the Millennial Generation, which I'm a card-carrying member of. So if you think about the experience of millennials, we were hit by two of the biggest recessions in a century in the early part of our careers, and we've got the scars to prove it in terms of slower wage growth, not accumulating wealth, and so on and so forth. And so I think we've essentially been in a slack labor market the entire this entire part of our lives. So when you go through two catastrophic events like that, where you and your peers are kind of the last hired, first fired, and you start to think that there's a lot outside your control and you lose trust and confidence in things like education. So, and meanwhile, all the stories that we're reading about education have to do with debt and underemployment and so on. And so I think that's part of the story of this fall in confidence is, another big recession. What can I do? I mean, this is, there's kind of a helplessness, I think, that is associated. But Dave, what do you think on that?
I won't add to that, but Nicole might have a comment.
Well, I was going to kind of turn it back on you, Andrew, and say, okay, if millennials are maybe have these particular characteristics of having been impacted by both of these recessions and being jaded about the value of education. So then turning to education that's going to meet those expectations or have a chance to gain the confidence of this group. You've talked before about how, younger generations expecting things to be more personalized or tailored or, things like that. And so I wonder if there's anything you would say, not leaving us in the point of we're helpless or hopeless, what, I guess, advantages or strengths do you see in this generation that education providers could seek to serve that better?
think that's right. I mean, I think that part of what we're talking about, part of the experience of all Americans really is that we're just used to things being really consumer friendly. We're used to being able to customize the products and services that we have the way we want them. And so I think, as that's happened in other parts of the economy, people start to expect it in education, for example, as well. And so certainly, I think there's a lot of opportunities that I think we're gonna touch on this later in this webinar. But there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to design educational experiences that can serve these learners well.
Well, that might be a good reason to kind of segue into a different question, although that kind of builds on your point, Andrew, around some of the dip in confidence that we've seen. But many people highlight the strong wage premium associated with degree programs, right? Especially the BA wage premium, and often the BA is an entry-level requirement in so many fields. What's the trade-off there, and how should we be thinking about degree and non-degree options? I know we've looked at this quite a bit in the data.
Not to avoid that question, but I think the consensus, to the extent there is one, is that this isn't an either or question. It's a both and. We're talking about more education and training. We're not talking about substituting for BAs. But I do think that, if we're going to move to an education and training system that is oriented towards providing learning that's personalized, that's skills-based, and that takes place over a lifetime, we just need to think bigger and beyond this degree versus non-degree debate. So I think we can continue growing BAs, but also have more certificates, have more apprenticeships, boot camps, employer training, MOOCs, all of the above. The beauty and, to some extent, the drawback of learning is that there's no upper bound, right? You can continue to learn more and more and more, and it has benefits, virtually unlimited benefits. But in the end, I think that people are going to have a mix of different kinds of learning experiences and different preferences for what works best for them based on where they're at in their lives and their career. And we have to have an education system that serves them well. On the whole, though, I think that we are moving to a world where that's less about credentials and more about where skills are the currency of learning to work, and less of an emphasis on credentials that are validated by industry. And so, and ultimately, I think that is a more equitable world, because when employers require college degrees, that often serves as a barrier to opportunity, especially for Black Americans and Latinos. And Dave mentioned our friend and colleague Byron Auguste over at Opportunity at Work, who's really focused on that issue. And they've demonstrated that there are a lot of talented, otherwise qualified workers who don't necessarily have college degrees that should have access to opportunities. And I remember Michael Baston, the president of Rockland Community College, had this great quote on one of our earlier webinars where he said, colleges and universities need to become gateways instead of gatekeepers, if I recall correctly. And so I think that is very much captures the moment that we're in.
Absolutely. I think that's such a perfect point, and how you emphasize the sort of both answer, Andrew, just because I think it's such a false choice when people say, well, are you steering everyone towards vocational training or skills training, and that it's no, it's what works best for that learner, and that it's not an end, that it's a step on a journey. And I think a lot of times what we've actually seen is that people who get started on an education path, even if it's a few courses or getting a certificate or something, that kind of propels them and motivates them to keep going because they've had a successful experience and seen a good outcome for themselves, rather than being too intimidated to even start because a program is 4 years long or very expensive or something like that. Just kind of getting people in the door as that gateway, I think is a great step.
And there are models. There's certificate first model, Many colleges are embedding certifications in, on the way to a BA, and I think we're going to see more of that. And I think that's a good thing. I think one thing that our data do suggest is, when you look at this chart in particular, is that non-degree and skills training, if we look at the population of Americans overall, that is what makes sense for most people, many of whom already have degrees. In some cases, they've got their degree and they're coming back and they're trying to, update their skills and, take that next step, get better at their job, or, get that next promotion. So I think that there is plenty of room for growth in those kinds of options.
Andrew, even I think you and I were looking at some National Student Clearinghouse data by type of credential and enrollment, and it's the post-baccalaureate and postgraduate certificates actually that are up in enrollment this fall, 4 and 5 percentage points. So there is interest in the skills and in the non-degree credentials that is across the spectrum of individuals.
I think one of the questions that's popped up in the chat in a few different forms, and I think speaks to some of this too, is that we see kind of playing out in this non-degree is even helping people start with where do they go, right? How do they even navigate the right programs? There's a question from Sue Rafferty here asking, how do we provide career exploration as a first step, rather than colleges just asking someone, okay, what do you want to major in, which doesn't always translate, or people may not know what are the majors that lead to particular jobs. I'd love for you guys to comment on that. I will give a shout out to your colleague, Ben Moldovsky, who has a report out a little bit earlier this week called Bridge Builders, looking at intermediaries, which I think is a topic that's come up in some of our previous webinars. I know Maria Flynn from Jobs for the Future raised this question of career navigation and what are the roles of intermediary organizations to help displaced workers, to help prospective students understand where do they want to go and what are the training programs that are provided. But I'd love for you to share a little bit about that, and then maybe we'll transition quickly into a conversation about online in particular, because that's certainly a big topic here. But Dave or Andrew, maybe you want to take that one.
Just really quickly say, we're not the experts that you are who are in the audience today of designing and delivering and being the intermediaries or providing the navigation and building systems. But everything you can do from a research perspective, talking to Americans broadly, that assistance, Nicole, you know the numbers, I think you did the analysis on that week, but less than a third feel confident they know which skills to develop and which skills an employer would value, and that kind of, where do I start even if I'm interested, piece is really very real.
Yeah, and just to your point, Jenna, I think the more you can make those opportunities for career exploration available at every level. So I would say in high school, absolutely, in college and community college, and even outside, people who are not enrolled yet, just having more robust opportunities for people to be able to do a job shadow or, some kind of exploration opportunity. We had a lot of students on our panels just talk about the value of internships that they had and how much they learned and that how much it changed their lives. I think it's still a missing piece for too many students, and I think it'd be hugely impactful.
And there are questions here today that you're sharing from the audience about employers' role, and any question we've asked about an employer's involvement in education and training increases likelihood, interest, confidence, desire. Those are strong preferences, and they're deep and broad at any stage of that journey. So those partnerships with employers deliver confidence. They also, provide a lot of things in terms of navigating and balancing it in work and education and all those pieces. So it's real, and it does make a tremendous difference from the perspective of people making a choice. Am I going to pursue or not? For sure. Jenna,
let's tackle online, and then we'll talk a little bit about implications for 2021. And then there's some additional great questions here that I want to make sure we get to in our remaining 15 minutes. But Andrew, of course, one of the biggest changes we've seen this year is this forced shift to online learning. And the story, of course, is pretty complex, but broadly speaking, what's the public's perspective with respect to online learning, and how does that compare? You know, we've looked at both the general public and then we've looked at current enrolled students. So we'd love to see interesting comparisons there.
So it's completely different, actually, which was a big surprise, I think, to us. So current students who we surveyed, and even young people who aren't, necessarily in school, their sentiments about online are actually much more negative. They're far more likely to prefer in-person learning. They think that the move to online hurt their ability to learn, their ability to interact with faculty, with their peers, and so on. And so we discussed this as we released this research. There was a bias, I think, among many reporters and journalists in the field that Gen Z is this extremely tech savvy generation, that they're going to want to do everything virtually, and that doesn't appear to be the case at all. They still place a really high value on those in-person experience, building their social capital, so on and so forth. The 25 and older population, on the other hand, we were surprised to find just how strongly they value the convenience and flexibility of online learning. Even when we asked them about their preference beyond the pandemic, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. And a lot of reasons that they prefer that, but they're more likely to be working, to have families. They've already, to a certain extent, established their networks, and also their time is just more valuable. Dave, I can tell from your face you want to jump in here.
I can tell from Jenna's face that we've got time to manage, so I'll wait.
I think that's a great point, Andrew. Again, one of those sort of avoiding the false narrative of either, is online the solution for everything, or is online, horrible? It's one of those, well, if we're trying to build an education system that can meet people where they are, then there's different solutions for different people. And so, for some people it doesn't work well, but for some people it's a godsend, and it can really be, a way to increase their access and their ability to complete a program. So
we featured many online learners throughout the course of this, and they said exactly that. And so, and it's not to say, making these generalizations, right? That's not to say that every young learner prefers in person or vice versa. The introverts among us and people who sort of prefer to learn independently. I took much of my education was online in the grand scheme of things, and I always preferred that kind of asynchronously learning. Just to say that everybody's different and there's not a one size fits all solution. I do think that there are some implications of online that we won't have time to discuss today, but it's going to be really interesting looking at 2021, what happens.
Right. Well, I think there's a lot more we can dig into here. Let's perhaps, Dave, maybe, I'd love for everyone to share kind of their biggest takeaway from this work, in particular, as we think about solutions. I know we've been, throughout this work, careful to say, let's surface what people are sharing and let's try to learn from this broader community. But I think before we turn to a few more audience questions, I'd say, Nicole and Andrew, if you want to start with one of the big things you've learned from this program or this project so far, I'd love to hear that. And then Dave, if you want to talk about, what do you see as the implications for 2021 as we go into this new year? What have we learned? What are some of the questions that your team will be paying attention to? Nicole, you want to go first?
Okay. Actually, Andrew, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think one of the big things that I learned as we think about people, navigating education and work in this pandemic is sort of what we're all experiencing when we ask people what their number. Dave spoke to the worry that people are having about their job loss. We found even when they're sort of in jobs that we feel like we're safe, there were still, had tremendous worry. When we asked current students what the number one challenge they face, they told us it was stress, anxiety, loneliness. And so I think, for educators and us, just thinking about helping people navigate, helping learners navigate the challenges they're facing, there's probably nothing more important we can do than those support services that aid people in dealing with those mental health challenges. And so that wasn't something that I envisioned doing research on back in February, but it just is a consistent theme, I would say, again and again. And so, that the value of those support services, mentoring, coaching, and other kinds of support services that are basically institutions have done an incredible job building just in time, as we've been talking to leaders in the field, are just so central.
Andrew, I was going to say something pretty similar. Absolutely, that really stood out to me as well. Is just the importance of the emotional barriers, for lack of a better word, of just even getting into education and then being able to persevere this year. So absolutely, I think all those support services are really key to, especially helping students who maybe first generation students, or people for whom maybe they don't have as many other people in their family or whatnot who have been through the experience. And then also, I think something that stood out to me was, even in the midst of everything that's going on, that we can't kind of put those career services on the back burner, or just sort of wait and say, okay, we're going to deal with this fire right now, and then we're going to think about career stuff later. That we heard again and again just how important that is, and people are thinking about that and are worried, and you can't start all of those services at the end, if we're really trying to make sure that education is delivering on the promise for these people who need that to work for them, then you have to be building that in from the beginning. And that has to be something that, even in the midst of this crisis, we're really focused on, as well as getting people those opportunities.
And Dave, as you think about implications of this work, of course, I'm very mindful, I think I've said this ad nauseum, but the pandemic is not over. But as we think about implications, and we think about heading into hopefully the last stretch of this, as we see a vaccine begin to come online, but what are the implications, and how will this drive your work moving forward?
Well, we'll continue to learn with you as a community. I hope you put questions that we should be looking to in 2021 from your perspectives into the chat and the Q&A, and we go through the transcripts each week and follow through, and goes into the hopper of research. I think there are maybe three things that are in the front of my mind, and right now. One is, for some individuals, a gap year and a delayed enrollment will be just fine. But when there's a gap in the track, and for some people who delayed enrollment or didn't pursue and didn't act, is there going to be a generation that loses an education pathway, and how do we help them get back on? So I'm very curious to see, after where we are spring and summer, and understanding how those individuals are thinking about returning to education or initiating it. So we saw those first time enrollment numbers so low this fall. A second piece we'll really look at is, we're not the experts in the pedagogy and format of online learning, but to the extent that that opens access up to people who are interested, the comment Andrew saw my face earlier is, there's a thread in communities of color that goes beyond kind of juggling and balancing work and life. We've just heard a number of people talk about, I feel I can learn this way, I feel safe, I feel affirmed, I feel like my voice is heard. And something about that format, I'm very curious to understand the appeal of online learning and the decision-making for those to whom it can open up access, with both the self-doubt and the issues of disparities and disequity, as well as the logistical challenges of life and cost. So that'll be a theme for us for sure. And then there's so much this redefining degrees to an extent that competencies are built in, and credentials and non-degree pathway interest. And I think understanding the front end of that it's one thing for us to be talking about it as a community of people in the field, but what does that mean at the kitchen table and at the bus stop and you know, the frontline workers, the people who need to take those opportunities into their lives and turn it, how are they thinking about and navigating and understanding what that means and finding a path forward at the front end? And then are those non-degree credentials, how are those translating into employment? You know, what does that mean when you're looking for a job and you're talking to employers, and are those recognized, and how do you turn that investment into the return you're aspiring to, and what do they need around those? Those to me feel like maybe the 4 pieces that I'm wondering about as we go forward in the next stages of, you know, I hope and believe there's recovery of health and recovery of economy as we look into 2021. And how do we come along with that as in the education?
And I'd say, I'll just reiterate, if folks want to drop in the chat things you'd like to make sure we're paying attention to for 2021. I know this team is eager to hear. There are a few questions that I'd love to get to if we can squeeze enough in here. But one is from Bob Castellucci. I hope I pronounced that correctly. But the question here, Bob, is, you know, what are the institutional barriers to more learner-centric, customizable learning programs within academia, and how can these be addressed? This is a conversation or a topic we've talked about with a lot of panelists. We've brought a lot of different experts in who are, you know, community college presidents, university leaders, folks working directly in communities. But maybe Andrew, if you want to take this one, I'd be curious, a summary of kind of what we've learned so far.
Well, I think, you know, there are the barriers, you know, it's just a really long list. Obviously, there's, you know, the regulatory infrastructure, I would say, is you know, to how we fund education and training programs is a major one. I think there are certainly opportunities to build innovative non-degree kinds of programs, but you know, you have to justify these. You know, you have to justify new programs and make the case for them. I think also there's you know, just the basic dynamics of institutional inertia. We've done things for a certain way for a really long time. You know, it's hard to overcome some of those internal barriers to start doing things a different way. So I think a lot of the innovation is going to come from a new set of providers, and then, you know, kind of the more traditional institutions will then have to adapt and compete with those. And we're seeing that take place to a certain extent. I have been amazingly impressed, however, with respect to online learning, just how rapid you know, many of the traditional institutions have been able to train their faculty up and deliver a product that is, you know, 10x better than what it was in the spring. And so I think these institutions are capable of adapting rapidly, but I agree that it's you know, there's a lot in the way.
Well, some schools, you know, traditional 4-year CARES money, some leaders are investing that and building for the future, not just responding to the moment. And so there will be things that we'll see as people respond to these needs, and to you know, disrupted workers and adult learners and people who have moved along but are short degrees who now have you know, can complete. And so I think the hybrid piece will be very interesting to watch, in the personalization of unbundling, both in time as well as in portable stackable credentials, but the kind of calendarization may become less rigid. And I think all those things start moving towards the personalization. And look, when enrollment is down and people feel a need, there's a marketplace, right? Supply is low and interest is high, demand is high. At some level, there will continue to be innovation.
Well, we're getting some great recommendations, by the way, and so we'll continue to take them. But I'm seeing, you know, can we track perceptions related to educator-sponsored education? I know that was a question that popped up a few times that we're probably not going to get a chance to to hit on, but I think that's a great point. Another attendee put in the point around career navigation, asking folks' desire to have that assistance and have those resources. I think that's something I know we've all been eager to follow. Digital inclusion is another piece on the wish list for 2021. So we've got some great things to think about here before we wrap up. But I am mindful of our time. We could be on here all day if we had the opportunity. But I will just close us up in saying thank you so much for joining us. As Dave mentioned, when the team was building the plane in March, wasn't quite sure who would be interested in what we were going to learn. But we've just seen a very sustained participation throughout the course of the year. We've been inspired by the input. Often the input that you've had have actually shaped some of the questions that we've then put into the field soon after these webinars. So thank you all for participating. This is being recorded. It will be on the website. You'll see the wrap up of the slides that the team presented today, and you can find all of the data on the website as well, which I know is in the chat. But thank you very much for joining, and happy holidays.